On April 20, 2010, a column of methane gas shot through 3 miles of rock and ocean and detonated a drilling rig in the Gulf of Mexico. 11 men died in 7 minutes. Most people blame corporate greed, but the real killer was a physics equation that every engineer on that rig already knew the answer to. This is the science they ignored, and the pressure that always wins.
Number 1 is the pressure balance. Imagine holding your thumb over the end of a garden hose. Water pushes against your thumb constantly, trying to escape. Keep your thumb there and you're in control. Remove it and everything behind it comes screaming out. That's exactly how a deep-water oil well works, except the garden hose is a column of steel pipe reaching 13,000 feet below the ocean floor. The water is methane gas that's been trapped in ancient rock for 60 million years, and your thumb is a column of heavy drilling fluid called mud. The entire time you're drilling a well, the weight of that mud is the only thing keeping oil and gas from rocketing up the pipe and onto your rig. Engineers call this hydrostatic pressure, and it's the single most important number in deep water drilling. Your mud has to push down harder than the formation pushes up. Too light and gas sneaks into the wellbore. That's called a kick. Too heavy and you fracture the rock and lose your mud into the formation. At the Macondo well, the margin between those two disasters was razor thin. The well sat beneath 5,000 feet of ocean in the Gulf of Mexico. The target reservoir lay another 13,000 feet below the seafloor. At those depths, the formation pressure was enormous. During drilling, the crew recorded 6 separate kicks. 6 times the well tried to blow out. 6 times the mud column held it back. But drilling mud was never meant to be the permanent seal. Once drilling is complete, you pump cement into the bottom of the well to lock it shut permanently. That cement becomes your real thumb on the hose. And at the Macondo well, the cement never held. Think about what that means for a moment. You have pressurized methane that's been trapped underground for 60 million years, pushing upward with roughly 13,000 pounds of force per square inch. The only permanent barrier between that gas and the ocean surface is a cement plug at the bottom of the well. If that plug develops even a single microscopic channel, the gas doesn't politely wait in line. It finds the gap and pushes through. Pressure never negotiates. But here's where the engineering turns reckless. Number 2 is the cement coffin. The cement pumped into the bottom of the Macondo well wasn't ordinary concrete. It was a specialized mixture called nitrogen-foamed cement, designed and mixed by a company called Halliburton. Standard cement is too heavy for a well this deep. Pump dense cement into a fragile reservoir and it fractures the rock, draining into the formation instead of sealing the well. So engineers whip nitrogen gas into the mixture to lighten it. Think of it like folding air into heavy cream. Same volume, less weight. The foamed cement at Macondo was designed at 14.5 pounds per gallon, roughly 12% lighter than standard. The problem is that nitrogen-foamed cement is inherently unstable. Those tiny gas bubbles can migrate through the slurry before it sets, carving microscopic channels through the finished plug, and those channels become highways for methane. Halliburton knew this. Weeks before the blowout, their engineers ran laboratory tests on the exact cement formula planned for the Macondo well. The results were alarming. Standard cement in those tests reached a compressive strength of 2,700 pounds per square inch. The nitrogen-foamed version barely hit 900, 1/3 the holding power. Halliburton had those results in hand before the cement job even started. They pumped it anyway. On top of the cement itself, Halliburton's own computer simulations had recommended 21 centralizers, metal sleeves that keep the pipes centered in the hole so cement flows evenly on all sides. Uncentered pipe means uneven cement, which means thin spots, which means channels for gas. BP approved only 6 centralizers. A BP engineer wrote in an internal email on April 16, 2010, it'll take 10 hours to install them. By that point, BP was $58 million over budget and 43 days behind schedule on the Macondo well. 10 hours felt like too long to wait.
Here's a number worth sitting with.
BP had spent over $1 billion drilling the Macondo well. The rig lease alone cost roughly $500,000 per day. Those 10 hours of centralizer installation were worth about $200,000. That's 0.02% of the total well cost. The cement job that was supposed to permanently seal a reservoir of pressurized methane gas cost roughly the same per foot as a cup of coffee, and it had already failed in the lab. Actually, the cement wasn't the last chance to stop the disaster. There was one more test and one more chance to walk away. Number 3 is the pressure lie. On the afternoon of April 20th, 2010, the crew of the Deepwater Horizon ran what's called a negative pressure test. This is the moment of truth for any deepwater well. You reduce the hydrostatic pressure inside the drill pipe and watch the gauges. If the cement at the bottom is holding, the pressure reading should bleed down to 0 and stay there. 0 means the well is sealed. 0 means safe. 0 means you can displace the heavy mud and walk away. The gauges didn't read 0. The drill pipe pressure climbed to 1,400 pounds per square inch. That reading meant only one thing. Methane was migrating through the failed cement and entering the wellbore. The cement had failed, and the instruments were telling everyone in the room exactly that. Jimmy Harrell, the senior Transocean rig supervisor, challenged the result. Something was clearly wrong. BP's company man on the rig, Don Vidrine, was uncertain about what the reading meant and called onshore engineers for guidance. Then someone offered an alternative explanation, the Bladder Effect. The theory was that heavy mud sitting in the riser above the blowout preventer was pushing down on the annular preventer, creating a false reading. It sounded plausible, except the Bladder Effect doesn't produce 1,400 pounds per square inch on the drill bite.
Every federal investigator who later examined the data confirmed that the only possible source of that pressure was formation fluid, almost certainly methane, leaking up through failed cement at the bottom of the well. But the crew accepted the explanation. At approximately 8 p.m., they began displacing the heavy drilling mud from the riser with lighter seawater. The cement that Halliburton knew was unstable, the cement that had just failed the negative pressure test, was now the only barrier between a pressurized methane reservoir and 11 men standing directly above it. Instead of 0 on the gauges, the crew got 1,400. Instead of stopping, they displaced the mud. And then the well answered. Number 4 is the 9-minute warning. At 9 p.m. on April 20th, the mud displacement was running smoothly. Seawater replaced the heavy drilling fluid in the riser exactly as planned. For roughly 30 minutes, nothing appeared wrong on the surface. Below the seafloor, methane was silently migrating through the cracked cement and flooding into the wellbore. The mud returns should have been the first red flag. Less fluid was coming back up the pipe than was being pumped down. In any drilling textbook on Earth, that means gas is displacing your mud. That's a kick. Nobody caught it in time. At 9:49 p.m., Andrea Fleitas was at the dynamic positioning station on the bridge when a sudden jolt ran through the entire rig. Her screens flooded with Magenta warnings. Magenta is the highest alert level for combustible gas on the platform. The methane had reached the surface. In the engine room, gas was being sucked into the air intakes of the diesel generators. Mike Williams, the chief electronics technician, heard the engines begin to rev far past their normal operating limits. Diesel engines do something terrifying when they ingest methane. They run away. The gas itself becomes additional fuel, and no throttle can stop outside air from feeding the acceleration because the fuel is coming in through the air intake, not the fuel line.
Williams watched the lights on the rig surge so bright they physically exploded in their fixtures. Then came the first explosion. Then a second, far larger blast. A fireball ripped through the derrick and swallowed the entire platform in flames. Between 9:49 and 9:56 p.m., 7 minutes passed. 7 minutes from the first jolt to total detonation. Jason Anderson, the senior tool pusher, was 35 years old with 2 young children. Shane Roshto was 22. Adam Weiss was 24. Roy Wyatt Kemp was 27, a derrick hand with a 2-year-old daughter named Kaylee and another daughter his wife Courtney was still carrying. They and 7 others were never found. Mike Williams, blinded by blood from shrapnel wounds to his forehead, stumbled through the burning wreckage to the edge of the rig. He looked down at a 10-story drop into the dark Gulf of Mexico, roughly 100 feet of open air between his boots and the black water below. Fire at his back, nothing below. He jumped.
But even after 11 men were dead and the rig was engulfed in flames, there was still one final system designed to stop the well from flowing. Number 5 is the 3-failure lock. Bolted to the wellhead on the ocean floor, 5,000 feet below the burning platform, sat the blowout preventer. It weighs 300 tons and stands 5 stories tall, a stack of hydraulic rams and pipe seals that represents the last line of defense in offshore drilling. At its core is a mechanism called the blind shear ram, 2 enormous steel blades designed to slam together, shear clean through the drill pipe, and seal the well shut in seconds. If the cement fails, if the mud is displaced, if the crew misses every kick warning, the blowout preventer is supposed to end the emergency before it becomes a catastrophe. On the night of April 20th, it failed 3 separate ways at the same time. First, one of its 2 redundant emergency control pods, designated the blue pod, had a dead battery and faulty wiring. That pod couldn't transmit the signal to activate the shear ram. Second, the hydraulic system that provides emergency force to the rams had a significant leak, which meant that even if the signal arrived, the rams might not have had enough force to close completely. But the third failure is the one that sealed the well's fate. When the blind shear ram likely did activate through the remaining control pod, it encountered a section of drill pipe that had buckled under the extreme forces of the blowout. A straight pipe shears cleanly between the blades. A buckled pipe wedges sideways and jams them open. The offshore drilling industry didn't fully understand this failure mode until after the federal investigation. The 300-ton device designed to be the absolute last resort, the fail-safe that justified every other risk taken on the Macondo Well, had a dead battery, a hydraulic leak, and a pipe geometry that no engineer had ever modeled. 3 independent failures in a single device at the single moment it was supposed to work.
Turns out the explosion was only the beginning. Number 6 is the invisible poison. The Deepwater Horizon sank on April 22nd, 2 days after the blast, but the well at the bottom of the ocean kept flowing. For 84 days, crude oil poured from the broken wellhead at roughly 62,000 barrels per day. By the time engineers finally capped it on July 15, 2010, an estimated 4.9 million barrels of crude had entered the Gulf of Mexico. That's roughly 206 million gallons, enough oil to fill over 300 Olympic swimming pools. The response was massive. More than 47,000 personnel and nearly 7,000 vessels were deployed across the Gulf. But the most controversial decision was the use of chemical dispersants. BP and the Coast Guard sprayed nearly 1.84 million gallons of a product called Corexit onto the ocean's surface, and for the first time in history, injected it directly at the broken wellhead 5,000 feet underwater. Here's what dispersants actually do. They don't remove oil from water. They break crude oil into microscopic droplets that sink below the surface and spread through the water column. The slick disappears from satellite images. The beaches look cleaner on the evening news, but the oil isn't gone. It's invisible. And invisible turned out to be far worse than visible. Researchers from Georgia Tech published findings in the journal Environmental Pollution showing that the combination of Corexit and crude oil was up to 52 times more toxic to marine organisms than the crude oil by itself. The dispersant weakens cell membranes in marine life, allowing the oil's most poisonous compounds to penetrate living tissue far more easily. Scientists at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution later discovered deep-sea plumes of dispersed oil stretching at depths of 3,000 to 4,000 feet, suspended in the water column like an invisible fog that no cleanup crew could ever reach. The surface looked clean. Everything below was poisoned. Yet the most disturbing discoveries didn't surface for years. Number 7 is the Mutation Clock. The Gulf of Mexico didn't die after the Deepwater Horizon spill, but it didn't recover either. It changed at the molecular level. Researchers studying Gulf killifish, small fish that inhabit the coastal marshes where the oil made landfall, found something unsettling. The crude oil activated a molecular signaling pathway called cytochrome P451A, the same system your body uses to break down toxins and foreign chemicals. In adult fish, this detox pathway went into overdrive and stayed elevated for more than a year after the oil arrived. But in their embryos, the exact same activation caused developmental defects. Offspring of exposed killifish showed cardiac abnormalities, disrupted gene expression across their liver and gill tissue, and direct evidence of damage to their genetic code at the cellular level. These weren't temporary effects that faded with the oil. The crude had rewritten the biological programming of an entire generation of fish. And the damage reached far deeper than the marshes. Scientists studying deep-sea coral colonies more than 4,000 feet below the surface found them coated in a brown film containing both crude oil and dispersant residue. Gene expression analysis revealed dramatic changes in the coral's immune response, wound repair systems, and ability to metabolize foreign compounds. 7 years after the spill, injured coral colonies were still losing branches at significantly higher rates than healthy ones nearby. The recovery timeline wasn't months or years, it was decades, if recovery comes at all. Meanwhile, microbial communities in the Gulf's deep sediments did something no one predicted. They evolved. New populations of bacteria emerged that could consume hydrocarbon compounds settled on the ocean floor. The Gulf's ecosystem didn't bounce back to its state before 2010. It became something entirely new. And no researcher alive today can tell you what that transformed ecosystem will look like in another 50 years.
11 families received phone calls on the night of April 20th. Courtney Kemp was 25 years old when she learned her husband Wyatt, a 27-year-old derrick hand, was among the 11 who would never come home. Their daughter Kaylee was 2. Their daughter Madison hadn't been born yet. Dale Burkeen had worked as a crane operator on the Deepwater Horizon for 10 years. He was 37. Gordon Jones was a drilling fluid specialist, just 28. His wife Michelle was pregnant with their second son when he died. None of them were killed by a freak accident. They died because a pressure test read 1400 when it should have read 0, and someone called it the Bladder Effect. They died because cement that had already failed in Halliburton's lab was pumped into a well anyway. They died because 10 hours of centralizer installation felt too expensive on a project that had already cost $1 billion. BP would eventually pay more than $65 billion in fines and settlements, the largest environmental penalty in American history. Halliburton settled for $1.1 billion. Transocean paid $1.4 billion. Those are staggering numbers, and they don't bring a single person home for dinner. The physics of a blowout comes down to one truth the drilling industry has understood since the first well was drilled. Pressure always wins. You can hold it back with mud, you can try to seal it with cement. You can build 300-ton machines to shear it shut as a last resort. But if you ignore the gauges, cut the barriers, and remove the weight before the seal is proven, pressure does what it's always done. It finds the weakest point and it breaks through. And the weakest point is never the rock. It's the decision made by the person standing above it. If you want to see what happens when the same kind of arrogance meets the same kind of physics, except with neutrons instead of methane, and a 14-pound metal sphere instead of a wellhead, the story of the Demon Core is right here on Sketchy Science.